Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. This will be the final podcast of 2021 as we're embarking on 2022. So I wanted to kind of do a quick wrap. It's that time of year, right, to be reflective, reflect back on the previous year and look forward to the next. So I thought, well, let me talk a little bit about some of the podcasts in the previous year, and then perhaps a little preview of what's to come in 2022. So, firstly, you'll notice I'm sitting somewhere different than I think I've sat on any of the previous podcasts. I'm sitting upstairs in the dining room, and the picture probably looks considerably clearer, right? Got a new webcam. I'd historically been using the crappy onboard webcam on my laptop, and again, aesthetics was never the point. In fact, the aesthetics kind of, if I worried about the aesthetics, it would only get in the way and make it feel like work. And if it felt like work, I'd be far less inclined to do it, and perhaps I would not do it at all. Because I work 9 to 5. I don't actually work 9 to 5. I work 9 to 5:30, Monday through Friday. But it's enough, right? This is fun. This is what I do for fun. So throughout the year, all right, let me wind back a hair. In 2021, sometime in late 2021, sometime in 2021, Joe Blevins and I had talked about perhaps doing for Ed Wood Wednesdays dual reviews of some of Ed's paperbacks, and that it never came to fruition because of me. Joe actually did publish a book review or two during that time frame, I think, at Ed Wood Wednesdays at the Dead to Rights blog, which we'll certainly link to here in the comments. But Joe mentioned it to me towards the tail end of the year. Hey, what about maybe next year? Well, going into next year, let's do X. Not, I think we said something like, well, let's do 4 book reviews, maybe spaced throughout the year, something like that. And then at the very tail end of the year, on a pure lark, and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite some of my buddies in Ed Wooddom to join me and talk about Ed Wood one afternoon, or I think it was in almost a year ago now, almost exactly a year ago, because it would be a year ago this coming weekend. It was, I believe, on the afternoon of a Sunday, January 3rd. 2021, we sat down, we did the first podcast. A couple things right out of the gate. I had more fun doing it than I expected, and then I thought, I'm going to keep doing this. I didn't really necessarily have an intent or a plan going into it, and it also became a good place, I think, for Joe and I to do our quote-unquote dual reviews. Much easier to talk it through. We've got very extensive on some of them, as you noted. Perhaps if you watched, we talked about the pair of Watts books early on in the year, as well as security risk. We did a pretty deep dive into sex salvation, and if you haven't seen that and you're not aware, you might be saying, well, what is that? That's not an Ed, I never heard of that. Is that an Ed Wood book? That was one. I'll get to it when I talk about some of the, my favorite discoveries of the year, but we talked about that and a few other texts as well, including a text. I think one of our most recent podcasts, Joe, myself got together with Jim Pontalillo, who was certainly a wonderful guest here at the podcast on numerous occasions throughout the year, and we talked about a rumored to be Ed Wood book, Mask of Evil, and came to the collective conclusion from our perspective that not an Ed Wood book. So you can check that out, as well as I believe 22 podcasts in total. So throughout the year, you'll find them on the YouTube channel, the Ed Wood Summit podcast. You'll also find them. Joe's been gracious to keep the podcast alive at Ed Wood Wednesdays, posting the link every week. Not every week, obviously. There's 52 weeks in the year, and there's 22 podcasts. So actually, again, not having gone into it with any intent at the beginning of the year, I was really happy that I did that many of them. Again, wasn't really expecting that. So I did want to sort of go into the year also sort of rededicating myself, very consciously wood them. Now, woodology, I don't think that I had necessarily strayed from it previously, but I really wanted to hunker down and say, there's got to be, beat my brains out over minutia, to a degree. I've been doing a ton of articles on the loops, which may have only been of interest to me and two or three other people. But it was very interesting to me, obviously. But I thought to myself, I don't really have much more to tell. Should I just keep transcribing loops ad infinitum, year after year, till the end of my days? I didn't think that made a whole hell of a lot of sense. So I ended up, after the first podcast, it sort of redirected me. We talked, and as I talked to my friends, we talked, and it sort of redirected me back into the world of the texts, which is kind of was the starting point when I first started writing for Ed Wood Wednesdays in 2015, all the way back the week before Halloween 2015. So it's been over 6 years running now. And I, at the time, was thinking, there's too many people claiming things that are written by Ed Wood that really aren't. And it's not that hard to, validate that. So put these little articles together on occasion and sort of debunk those claims, those attributions, as I pseudo-wittily called them, attributions, attributions to Ed, and in matter of fact, we can prove otherwise. So you'll find again some of those articles at Ed Wood Wednesdays. But something funny happened on the way to the podcast, I guess, because years later, start doing the podcast, it reframes my thinking around the text, and I, in the interim, didn't entirely not pay attention to ed text. You'll find, in fact, a lot of articles about the magazines, the Pendulum mags, as well as the later Swedish erotic mag, attempts to even sort of ID some of work that I think may have been written by Ed, and we never will know for sure, things that are uncredited, and editorials. Last week's article at Ed Wood Wednesdays was just a little Christmas missive. Here's a little perhaps real end for you. Merry Christmas. Some editorials from the Pendulum all-male mag, The Boyfriends. So check that out. And if you'd like to. If you don't want to, don't. I think I don't get a whole hell of a lot of feedback one way or the other. And I could see the number of viewership numbers at the podcast are generally pretty low. Again, don't do it for that reason. It's nice if you enjoy it, if you watch it and you actually enjoy it. And I know there are a handful of you that do, who I do get feedback from regularly. A couple bits of feedback that I've commonly got, though, not only this year, not only related to the podcast, but generally over time, not often, but are that it's the the porn. You're too interested in Ed's porn work, Greg. Why are you so that's really throwaway. We don't need to have our noses rubbed in it to this extent. And it was just, he was doing it because he was desperate to make $1. Maybe, right? Maybe. Certainly he was doing it to try to make a living. I don't know that if it were push come to shove, oh my God, I've gotta Bernie Bloom will pay me $5.50 an hour to write sex short stories. I'm so disgusted by it that I hate myself. I'm so disgusted by it. I can't imagine what Ed Wood was thinking, by the way. This may be a real offensive podcast. Greg was trying to speak on behalf of Ed. I'm trying to speak on behalf of myself about the pornographic, the adult texts that Ed worked on, and certainly the adult films that he got involved in. This occupies, the better part of the last 15 years of his life in total, when you start with the paperbacks and magazine work right up to the very end. We do have a quote, I believe, in Nightmare of Ecstasy to the effect he really, or maybe even more than one quote, he really hated that he had sunk so low. I think, in matter of fact, by about 1975 or 76, at this point, his health isn't all that great. He's drinking very, very heavily, and there's nothing left to write in the magazines other than sort of filler. He can't really write short stories, and he could write very imaginative, creative short stories for the Pendulum magazines, including Calga magazine, as well as Sex Press, Edge of Sex mags. It was generally, though, Pendulum and Calga mags that he wrote the most for, and they were the most prolific under the sort of Bloom family of magazines the under the arc of Bernie Bloom. Changed over time again, complicated relationship that Bernie had with I think Michael Thieves. I think it was complicated. It got complicated a little bit towards the tail end of it, is what I think, when Bernie started to um, branch out on his own, perhaps even to a degree moonlighting. Somebody who wrote for Bernie Bloom actually speculated that to me 4 or 5 years ago, said he was moonlighting on publishing under other imprints, moonlighting behind Michael Thieves' back. A dangerous thing to do, actually. Michael Thieves, if that is so, it would have been a dangerous thing to do, because Michael Thieves, of course, ended up on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, ended up in jail for murder. So a very, very dangerous thing, especially when he was the money man, presumably the money man who brought Bernie into the fold to start the West Coast operation of Pendulum Public. This is how these podcasts. I'm going to briefly reflect on last year and then talk about what's coming in the coming year. So let's go back to the pornography, right? Is Ed at this point? Maybe, I think, perhaps there's an element of truth to the fact that within the last couple of years he's pretty well churning it out, and it's boring. Now he's churning out, he's writing mostly, there's no more short stories in these later Swedish erotica magazines. There's no more articles. There is essentially texts that accompany photo pictorials, and the photo pictorials are front and center. The lion's share of the magazine is occupied by that, by far. And in some cases, he doesn't have a whole lot of real estate to work with. Write not captions necessarily. He did write captions for photos along the way in numerous iterations. But by this point, he's sort of generally in the Swedish erotica film mags. He's reviewing a loop. Reviewing one of the later Swedish erotica loops. I don't think he was involved on set at this point. It was, again, his health was not good. The shoots themselves were being conducted by this point in San Francisco. I can't imagine him regularly making the trek, because they shot hundreds and hundreds of Swedish erotica loops. Anyway, again, I'm going off on a tangent. I think, in other words, if he hated doing it I've said this before, actually, on the podcast, on a previous podcast, if he hated doing it that much, he would have found something else to do. It wasn't as if he couldn't go out and get a low-paying job doing any number of things to just eke by, because that's all he was essentially doing, eking by. $5.50, not really that bad. I remember in the late 1990s, I had a job that paid me once like $7.50 an hour, with a little bit of a spiff on top of that. It was a sales job, but that was real shitty pay back then. $5.50 actually seems like might have been not horrific, and he could get bonuses for writing additional paperbacks that Pendulum would publish under a variety of imprints. And he did, as we know, write for a variety of other paperback imprints. And that's something that in the previous year we I kicked the tires hard on Eros Goldstripe, a publisher. And there's a couple podcasts about the larger subjects, but the Eros Goldstripe imprint, and Ruben Sturman, the publisher, Leonard Bertman, the I guess guy who put the magazines together, editor, publisher, probably is better description of Leonard Bertman. Sturman would have been more so the distributor, the big man on top, right? The big man on top. He controlled a huge amount of the distribution of pornographic magazines, as well as other related items in the adult industry during the 1970s. And Ed certainly wrote for Eros Goldstripe. So let's go back to Sex Salvation really quickly. One of my favorite discoveries of last year was I was actually sitting right in this chair when it happened, as a matter of fact. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the fall, I think a late summer, early fall perhaps, and I was going through a variety of scans of a bunch of adult paperbacks that I thought were in the kind of zones where Ed Wood's work could have potentially appeared. It's totally, again, the fishing expedition notion. But all of a sudden, I took a glance, it jumped right out at me, and I knew immediately this is absolutely an Ed Wood book. I shared it with a few folks who wholeheartedly agreed with me, and Joe Blevins agreed to come onto the podcast, and we broke it down at length. But he also, so the, stumbling across it in the fishing expedition was really wonderful, but he took it one step further, and he connected the dot to a book rarely mentioned in woodology, a supposedly lost book called Saving Grace. So, and it's pretty clear that Sex Salvation is the book, aka Saving Grace, that Kathy Wood actually mentions in Nightmare of Ecstasy. So we broke that one down at length. You can go back and check that one out, that podcast. But that was the Eros Goldstripe publication. In the Eros Goldstripe magazines, I mentioned Jim Pontilillo earlier. We talked with Jim about Mask of Evil. Joe and I did, and Jim and I talked at length about Eros Goldstripe a little bit more generally, and talked about such publications as Female Mimics and Female Mimics, in fact. And it was Jim's discovery, another one of my favorite moments of the year, that TV Lust, Ed's TV Lust, 1977 paperback that was in fact originally published by Eros Goldstripe, was serialized across, I think, 10 issues of Female Mimics in the mid to late 80s, somewhere around 1986, give or take a year, 85, 86, 86, 87, somewhere around there. So you can go back and check that podcast out for the actual details, and I believe there's links. Go back to Edward Wednesdays as well, and there's a index of all the different podcasts, because sometimes you'll find links at Edward Wednesdays and additional collateral that you won't actually find if you just access the podcast through YouTube, where sometimes there's just a quick description and not much else, maybe a hyperlink or two, but there might be some additional collateral. In fact, that particular podcast about Eros Goldstripe, I tacked on an Eros Goldstripe story that I thought was worth considering as potentially having been written by Ed Wood. I didn't make a conclusion, and I don't think anybody ever opined on that one. I have an opinion. I'm going to withhold it. Maybe somebody will take a look at it and opine. So in any case, people have on scant occasions given me feedback that Ed's pornographic work, Greg, is it's not worth it. We don't really want to know about it. I don't do it because other people don't want to hear it. And I'm not trying to be, belligerent. Clearly, I'm the most belligerent person you'll ever meet. Actually, I despise conflict. I will avoid conflict at all costs, and I've meditated off and on through my adult life to try to make sure that I have a good amount of impulse control. It's important to me personally. This isn't about me again, right? This is about Ed Wood, his bottom of the barrel work in pornography. I think it says a lot about one's viewpoint on pornography, right? And whatever your viewpoint is, I totally respect it. But if you think about Ed, especially in many editorials, he would talk about, our puritanical society who finds sex dirty. That's essentially what people. I tie the two things together. So Ed himself, on many occasions and many editorials for many magazines, and expressed the sentiment of tolerance and sexual freedom many times over through a variety of means, off and on throughout his whole entire adult life. So I don't really buy the notion that it's the muck. It's adult work is the muck. I don't think he would have necessarily thought of it that way. I do think, though, as time wore on and he realized that there was no creativity allowed him any longer, that pornography had, by this point, become just, very, very graphic and more distanced from, its beginnings. It sort of evolved out of, sex magazines that were softcore sex magazines, softcore sex movies, exploitation movies that slowly over time became a little bit more graphic. Certainly the influences of burlesque maybe on the exploitation film world. Go back to Glen or Glenda again, being produced by George Weiss, who produced a lot of burlesque shorts as well as a number of features, right at Quality Studios, where Ed, of course, shot uh, some footage for Glen or Glenda, but certainly also shot much of Plan 9 from Outer Space, among other things, and that were shot at Quality over time. So that's, again, one bit of feedback. Second bit of feedback is, and many people, not actually, yeah, more than a handful, who I've corresponded with, and in talking about Ed Wood, we'll share items with one another. Commonly done this for a number of years with a number of people, and on occasion I've shared something from Ed's all male work, and I've had it happen now on numerous occasions where somebody goes, "Greg, I don't want to see that. I don't want to have it. I'm not interested in that part of Ed's work." So I find that interesting as well. Tolerant of heterosexual pornography, but I don't. Intolerance not the right word. I'll offend some of my friends who've expressed this to me. Actually, I've already done it. I'm sure. I respect your viewpoints, guys. It's not your thing, right? But I'm going to research it nonetheless. I guess I'll leave it at that, since I've already sort of, hinted that. Well, I've had conversations with other people about it, and I would think, what you ultimately have an affinity for is very specific to you, and it's rooted in a lot of complicated psychology and your upbringing and your nature and nurture, and a whole bunch of other things as well. So I guess I should get off that topic and leave it at that. So let's talk a little bit about other highlight moments in 2021. So coming across an Ed Wood book, unattributed previously, I think was a pretty big deal. I think, again, the serialized version of TV, less knowing that it was serialized in a magazine some years later, I thought that was great, a great catch. The script for the Frank Leahy Legend, the script that Ed wrote, that's Chanel. Chanel hasn't made an appearance at the podcast in quite some time, so she's at the front window protecting the house right now. So the Frank Leahy Legend. So Paul Apel, Paul Apel, and myself broke that one down in a fairly detailed podcast. Both of us had managed to obtain a copy of the script from a university archive. You can find all these details again. A lot of collateral around Frank Leahy generally in the early part of the year. The springtime, roughly. And that was extremely exciting because I wasn't even looking for it, and Paul and I think we're probably the first couple of people to have read that sucker. Probably since it was originally written, and how many people beyond that might have even read it, a handful perhaps. So if you haven't gotten around to that one, requesting a copy from the archive yourself, and if you're patient, you might as well wait it out, because I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but the game plan is to put this one out in book form, and that's on track for sometime in 2022, hopefully. And it will have additional collateral, including annotations, kind of around this entire screenplay, as well as some other collateral, a little bit of an apparatus attached to the script for the Frank Leahy Legend. A very, very interesting, obviously. Now I'm going to get back into talking about this, because it's so uncharacteristic of Ed to write about a football coach who was a win at all costs sort of sensibility for a big university, and nothing else really. There's not a lot like it. Nothing else really like it, and throughout his prolific body of work. So that's fascinating, and we shared a lot, Paul and I, in a couple of articles at Ed Wood Wednesdays, as well as a couple of podcasts. I also did a podcast where I kind of took a brief tour through the book. I know that Paul recently read the book and made some more annotations and linkages to the screenplay, or compare and contrast how it may be different from the book, elements of the screenplay. So that'll be in the annotations to the Frank Leahy legend. Hopefully, you'll have it on your bookshelf sometime in 2022. So that was a pretty big deal, I thought. What else? Let's see. Oh, a project that initially excited me a great deal, and then very quickly left me feeling confused and perhaps a bit frustrated. And then my excitement level has waxed and waned a little bit through the end part of the year. I've been busy. This is why you haven't seen me in a podcast in a little while. The holidays, it's been kind of busy here at the tail end of the year. I'm hoping, with the new year, new day dawn. Yeah, we all have all these hopes and dreams for our new year, right? Resolutions, etc. But I want to get back on track with this particular project. Rob Huffman and myself did a podcast on it sometime, I believe, probably in the summer, latter part of the summer, perhaps. France magazines and Ed's potential involvement writing for France magazines. We kind of autopsied an issue of a France magazine, talked about another short story that someone had once speculated many moons ago was written by Ed Wood. We talked about some of the additional sort of evidence, that little clues that had been dropped. I'm not sure if it constitutes evidence. So what had happened, I'd mentioned a few of these other gentlemen already. I looped Paul Apel and James Ponzilillo in on it and said, hey, how about the four of us? It's going to take a lot of legwork to try to take a deep dive into this whole France scenario, and they agreed to go along with me. And I think I very quickly got, like I said, confused. Rob stuck to it and really made some progress. Jim, we agreed early on Jim's role, because he's done such amazing textual analysis around Ed's paperbacks in particular. Let's let him loose on some of these France texts and see if it lines up. Can we really make it? Again, we're never going to have probably a credit, a document that says Ed wrote this. But could we make a credible case for it? My initial suspicion after reading a few things was quite enthusiastic, which is why I looped these guys into it. I'm like, guess what? And then a little deflated as I got a little bit deeper into it. And then looking back at some of the things that originally excited me, I started again to get a little bit more confused. And all I'll leave this at is that I got a long... and again, having dropped the subject far from it, it just needed to, I think... I needed to get a little space from it and reframe it in my mind. And I got a lengthy email from Rob just a few days before Christmas, just last week, as a matter of fact, and really went into great detail with a lot of new, fresh thoughts. R.E. Ed's possible writing for France books. So, and I got another France book, as a matter of fact. It's not an Ed Wood book, but a France book for Christmas. So that was kind of nice. And so lots more to come on France. And the initial idea, again, was to try to see, could we substantiate Ed writing for them and maybe index some of the work under the imprint. And additional, I want to thank Rob for he sent me another France mag, as a matter of fact, a few days before he sent me that rather lengthy email with all those very wise thoughts in it. So I'm going to get to, actually, I'll save that for the end. I'm very blessed and privileged to know a lot of fine folks. I'm going to have a cigarette. I ate dinner right before I sat down to do this podcast, and unfortunately, I think I smoked on a previous podcast, but I might as well, right? I mean, they're my lungs. It's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible habit, and I've had it for a very, very long time. So that's a good jump-off point. So another great highlight of my year, which I think I haven't talked about at all on a podcast, and only a few people really know the details of. But during the latter part of the summer, I was able to get in touch with a couple of folks who worked closely with Ed on more than one occasion. And when I say closely, on screenplays that he wrote, as well as films that he appeared in, acting with him under his directorship. Uh, so you're probably wondering, who the heck could that be? Two people, yeah. And became actually, I want to say, we continue to have exchanges through the latter half of the year. And I want to say, we've talked on a personal level, additional to Ed Wood, because, again, I was able to, sort of ascertain what they remembered about Ed Wood fairly quickly, but we continued to talk, and so there will be more information to come. I don't know if it'll be articles, if it'll be perhaps a podcast. One of those folks has agreed to do a podcast, and it almost came to fruition a few months back, but kind of unwound for technological reasons at the tail end of it. But more to come, certainly, either here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast, or at Ed Wood Wednesdays at the Dead to Rights blog, d2rights.blogspot.com. Joe Blevins' wonderful site, home of Ed Wood Wednesdays, since actually long before I started writing there, since 2013. If you haven't been there, I plug it all the time for obvious reasons. It's an absolute trove of information. I think I said it on a podcast earlier this year. I think I might have said it in the very first podcast. I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about what I'm talking about if it weren't for Ed Wood Wednesdays really, really lighting us a sort of sparking a fire to a degree in terms of, wow, Ed Wood's somebody I've always been interested in, but this is really fascinating if you dig a little bit deeper. This site is really digging deep, and sort of inspired me to start digging a little bit deeper myself, and enjoyed it immensely. So I'm going to forget who else was. I named a number of the folks, and I wasn't planning on name dropping necessarily because I don't want to forget anybody, but now that I've named a number of folks, I want to thank some other folks who came on the podcast. The original group on the podcast, there was Jim Pontalillo, Joe Blevins, and myself. We also had, we were also graciously joined by Keith Crocker and Mike Hickey, Mike H., and they talked about Ed Wood along with me, all those guys, and we came back in the, I think it was about the mid part of the year, a little past the midpoint of the year. We came back and did it all over again, and everybody graciously came back, and we talked more about things related to Ed Wood. So I'm grateful to all those gentlemen, obviously. Grateful to, I mentioned Paul, I mentioned Rob, grateful to them as well. And I want to mention, I believe the additional guests that we had, that accounts for, I'm going to forget somebody, and that's going to really be upsetting to that individual, perhaps. That's really not going to be, right? I've already upset people with you're intolerant because you don't like Ed's all-male work. I've already upset a number of people by saying that. So, Robert Monell joined me and talked about, he, at the very end of her sadly short life, Valda Hansen was corresponded with Robert Monell, great film writer, written a great deal of stuff, especially about European sort of cult cinema through the years for a lot of great publications, like back in the day, European Trash. And I ascribed to his resume, and Bob corrected me on it when we did the podcast. I'm like, and he wrote for Video Watchdog, and I swear to God, I still have that in my mind, that I remember reading Robert Monell's work in Video Watchdog for some reason, even though he told me, no, that Greg, that didn't really happen. It's amazing how your mind can and does play tricks on you, especially as you get older. So, if I forgot anybody, I really, really do apologize. I know you're probably thinking, if you're an avid watcher, I did start a sister podcast. I started enjoying doing the Ed Wood Summit podcast, and I thought I need to start something that when I have topics that are outside the scope, and I was a little bit interested in sort of Aussie exploitation films in the early part of the year, and somehow had a couple quick exchanges with the great Ozploitation director Brian Trenchard Smith. So on a whim one day, I said, "Yeah, you want to do a podcast?" And I thought, well, this has to go into its own podcast. This isn't an Ed Wood story, so I started a podcast. I actually said to Paul Apel one day, I'm like, Paul, you're good at you're quick with this kind of stuff. Come up with a title for me for the podcast. And he came up with a couple things that he threw at me, but I readily agreed, and I think he said this was my favorite as well. He came up with these very quickly off the top of his head. And so that's Faster Podcast Kill Kill. I think, again, give him all the credit in the world for that title. And I only ever pursued, that's something I want to do in 2022 as I look forward, is I want to do more podcasts branching out from subjects beyond Ed Wood at Faster Podcast Kill Kill. The only additional podcast I want to thank Brian Trenchard Smith, obviously. Great to talk to him. A little intimidating, obviously. Great director who made such, so many amazing classics through the years. The Man from Hong Kong, Turkey Shoot, Stunt Rock. I could go on, and I won't. But check that podcast out. But fortunately, Brian was a great raconteur. I was ill-prepared a bit because I did it on my lunch break during work that day. He could only join me during the daytime. And so I was racing a little bit, and I don't feel like I was, as present and available in that conversation as I should have been. But he carried the podcast. And I was grateful that he talked a little bit about, having met Sir Run Run Shaw, some stories that are less commonly told in his sort of overall biography, But anyway, the second Faster Podcast Kill Kill that I did was many moons later, and it was with a gentleman named Richard Rossi, who I met in a private Ed Wood Facebook group, which was where I met, I think, everybody else who appeared on the Ed Wood Summit podcast throughout the year. So we did talk a little bit about Ed Wood, but we talked more so about Richard's very eclectic career, mostly in film, and he did a lot of really wonderful other interesting things. So I would highly encourage you to check that podcast out if you're into that kind of eclecticism. He did a great movie a few years back, Canaan Land, and I believe that might be streaming on Prime now, so you might want to check that out. He also, and this comes up in the podcast, you'll see if you've watched it, you already know. He, as a child, appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He appears in the background of the diner scene with Sam Jackson and John Travolta talking in the diner. In Pulp Fiction, we talk about a few of other things. You can look at his resume. So kind of a very interesting filmography, and we had a really fun conversation. I was grateful again for Richard coming by. So I think that accounts for everybody that I talked to. Making sure, I hope I didn't forget anybody, and if I did, I'm wholeheartedly sorry. My apologies if I've forgotten you. Now, I've talked to a lot of other people throughout the year, and we talked a little bit, or I've even said, hey, let's do a podcast. I haven't forgotten. If I haven't gotten back to you, it's not that I've forgotten or that I ditched the idea. If you've agreed to it previously, I'm probably going to hit you up at some point eventually. It's just that I talk to a lot of people, and I get very enthused about things, and I have, what's the words, or the line, my eyes are bigger than my stomach, right? My eyes are bigger than my stomach. My to-do list is, going to occupy me for the rest of my life. So, and then new things come up, and I tend to get very impulsively interested when something new and fresh comes up, and throw my energy behind it. And that's where follow through has always been a struggle for me throughout my adult life. Why generally the format of the podcast, the format of Ed Wood Wednesdays, works really well for me, because it's a circumscribed format by its nature. It's not like writing a novel, making a film, something like that. I guess let me reflect back on 2021 briefly for another moment, and make sure I haven't forgotten anything else. Oh, so in the coming year, there'll be more of the book reviews, certainly exhaustive sort of dives. One thing in 2021 was the podcasts right out of the gate turned out to be much longer than I've had any expectation that they would be. I've been sitting here now for a little over 39 minutes, as a matter of fact. It just sort of happens that way. I would have thought, God, I'm going to test people's patience. The fact of the matter is, most people don't stick around that long. A lot of people that might even click on it are gonzo. The bounce rate is pretty high, and I get it. It's very niche topics, and it is asking a lot of your time. So I do really appreciate the folks who do enjoy this. Again, the perhaps handful of folks. But I don't, again, do this for any other reason than I really, really enjoy it. So I'm not worried about it. And initially I thought, should I try to make these things shorter? And I certainly gotten a little bit of feedback on that score, a little bit of negative feedback. Greg, they're pretty damn lengthy. How much? I know the underlying notion there is, how much time do you think we have? We're busy in our lives just like everybody else is. And kind of, get to the point, cut to the chase. I feel that in some cases, certainly, it's warranted to get into that kind of depth. It's necessary, for the book dives, for instance. I think it's something. Ed's books haven't really ever been taken all that seriously, other than quick indexes and little overviews of them, and sort of snickering, sort of another book where Ed's weird writing style and his weird obsessions are at the fore. Another great highlight of the year related when the topic is sex. I get these things wrong sometimes, but when the subject is sex, when the topic is sex, out from Bear Manor Media just this December, just actually hit the streets a couple of weeks ago. So that is a thick volume of articles written for the Pendulum and Calga et al. Magazines that Ed wrote for in the early half of the 70s. So that, again, that's somebody worth thanking as well, who's always been a supporter of Edwood Wednesdays in promoting the site to wood fans out there. Bob Blackburn, the co-heir of Kathy Wood's estate, and Bob, that's now the third compilation that Bob's put out of work from the magazines, which I think is, he's certainly to be commended for. That's a lot of textual work for us to pore over that would otherwise be extremely, extremely hard to access unless you spent quite a bit of money buying the old Pendulum mags, which this year I did end up buying a handful off and on through the year. I try to avoid doing that because it can get real pricey real quick, but I was able to grab a handful. I did actually this year end up buying a lot of paperbacks on fishing expeditions, paperbacks that I know are tangentially related to Ed Wood, but a few genuine Ed Wood paperbacks as well. Let me reflect back again before I move on to 2022. Make sure I forget what other. I'm sure there's something eluding me on the spot here right now. I realized in this. Met a gentleman who hasn't joined me on a podcast yet, and has sort of semi-agreed to at some point in the near future, and I hope he does. And I'll talk about one of those items to intrigue you, seed your interest. One of the items that we'll probably likely talk about. One of the best researchers I ever know. Not going to name him by name until he agrees to come here on the podcast. But he and I have batted around some Ed Wood research for the last probably 6 months or so, and research generally into the adult industry, the vintage adult industry. He knows it enormously well, and again, his research abilities are absolutely astounding. He finds things out that make my jaw drop sometimes on a near daily basis. I did want to mention. I'll get to that in a second. So he also recently made a great find that what is generally considered to be, commonly considered to be, an Ed Wood pseudonym. One that, if you're a more than casual Ed Wood fan, you would go, yeah, that's an Ed Wood pseudonym, is in fact not, and is a real guy. So some of the work that we think was Ed Wood, that is in fact attributed to Ed Wood commonly, ain't so. So that will be hopefully forthcoming fairly early on in the year. We'll get to that story. Related, it reminded me, somebody else I spoke to uh, the latter half of the year off and on for a little bit, was a writer. Again, not going to name names until perhaps this individual agrees to talk to me on a podcast, or we work up something a little more genuinely into kind of an article. But this particular individual wrote at least one, if not two, publishers where Ed's work was also published in the early half of the 70s. So we've had a few exchanges on and off through the latter part of the year. So that's been kind of fun talking again to somebody else who worked pretty closely with Ed Wood. So that's a lot of the highlights of 2021. 2022, yeah, this pseudonym is shortly going to fall. It'll be earth-shattering news, I'm sure. Also, pretty confident, I'm pretty confident, but it'll be Joe, Jim, and myself getting back here to talk about this. So, an Ed Wood book that we have a suspicion is written by Ed Wood, and again, would be one obviously that thus far has not been attributed to him. So I'll give you a hint as to my conclusion. I'm not exactly sure until we get to it what both of those guys are going to think. Actually, I do have a pretty good inkling what Jim thinks, but I think it's going to be big news. Let me put it that way and couch my opinion that way. Big news. Also, an additional book which I need to do a little more work with in terms of sort of coming to a conclusion. But I do have another individual who I shared the notion with and took a look at it, and initially thought, no, I don't think so. And then literally a couple of years later was like, I took another look at that. So that potentially another book written by Ed Wood that thus far has not been attributed to him. A couple others. Again, I don't want to get into the details until I actually have cogent things to say, because I hope to get to this in 2022 as well. But a couple other books that, again, back in the day I actually said, no, that's not an Ed Wood book. In fact, in some cases wrote about pretty confidently coming to that conclusion on some really early Ed Wood Wednesdays articles, and coming back around the bend all these years later from a essentially knowing more just from research over time, as well as getting to know other individuals whose opinions I respect enormously, and I can bounce this stuff off of them, and they can validate or perhaps not tell me to go pound sand. So that's all, forthcoming more about texts that hopefully more than one that we'll be able to announce pretty confidently is in fact written by Ed Wood. But again, we'll probably never be able to say for sure because we don't have it on a resume. We don't have it documented anywhere that it was something written by Ed Wood. So let me think. The France imprint I already mentioned, so I think Rob and I will be back relatively soon to sort of reignite that conversation and reset it in a certain direction, and then shortly thereafter, hopefully we'll be able to make some progress and come back and report something more substantial to you guys about Ed's possible involvement at France, the imprint France magazines, France Books, in circa 1960. 263 is the time frame we're talking about there. So that if we do ultimately substantiate that, I think would be a pretty big deal, because it would be his earliest known work in the adult sort of publishing industry, predating Killer and Drag from 1963. Oh, speaking of, that was Blacklace Drag, originally published by Raven Books, came out under a few different imprints later on, and is better known today as Killer and Drag. Raven Books, I've actually gotten a good amount of information together around to sort of index pretty much all the Raven books. And in fact, I grabbed a few more, and I might grab a couple of others on a whim. And again, a little bit of a fishing expedition, perhaps. Nothing that screams out to me like a pseudonym that might be recognizably Ed, but it was a very obscure publisher. That's one among many things, hopefully, I'll get to in 2022. Many other articles that have been in development in some cases for years, literally years, and some lengthier pieces on a few individuals that I think are pretty fascinating. Hopefully we'll get to them in 2022, and you'll see them in some shape or form. If they're the type of thing where I have a lot of documentary sort of items to show, and a lot of factual evidence to get into, probably be this is the kind of thing you'll see in an article. Depends. More than likely, the podcast is reserved more for conversational opinions around things. What's interesting now that I say it, let's take a look back at 2021 briefly again. The podcast that kind of significantly got the highest number of views. I think it's close to probably 500 views now. Oh, that's really rarefied air. It's actually about T.K. Peters, and sort of end a fairly lengthy dive into, who was T.K. Peters, and I enjoyed doing that immensely. That was something that, was an article that sort of forestalled over and over and over again because I kept finding out more new information, but I decided to do that one as a podcast. So you never know what might come down the pike here in 2022 at Edwood Wednesdays, or here at the Edwood Summit Podcast. I do also need to thank, I was lucky enough to get a couple folks to sponsor the podcasts in 2021. So any podcast that they sponsored, you'll hear that my plug in that particular podcast. But just to thank them again, and looking back at the year, xxbooks.com. That's triple X books. So spell out the triple, then just one X, spell out books.com. Actually, through the end of the year, you only have a few more days to catch it. It is the December sale at Triple X Books, where you can get scans for only $1. So head on over there. Upwards now of probably close to 20,000 books you'll find there. Mostly digital scans, as well as a vast number, though, of actual material copies of adult paperback books as well. So, gentleman is a really good guy who runs the site, and I certainly encourage you to head on over to Triple X Books, buy a few books, and even though I'm not saying sponsoring the podcast any longer, but tell him you heard about it on the Edwood Summit Podcast. That would be nice. He would appreciate, I think, knowing where his audience comes from, where his customers come from. Also, a podcast towards the tail end of the year was sponsored by 30th Street Graphics, 30sg.com, 30th Street Graphics, and another great guy who runs that site, and I was happy to have him agree to do sponsorship of one of the podcasts. So go over to 30thstreetgraphics.com. Mostly there you'll find fetish, things related to fetish, mostly vintage fetish magazines for the most part, but the proprietor does a really great job scanning the mags. He's really a perfectionist about that, and scans them himself from his own collection, and is a really smart, fun guy who I've had some rather lengthy conversations with. And I need to get him to tentatively agree to come on and do a podcast, so that would be something that might turn up on Faster Podcast Kill, hopefully at some point in the relatively near future, and we can talk a little bit, because again, we would be talking about more so fetish magazines and that space that you can explore at 30thstreetgraphics.com. So the only other thing I'm sort of forgetting to mention, I'm sure I'm going to forget I'm forgetting a whole bunch of things as soon as I, say sayonara at the end of this. I'll go like, oh, I forgot about that. So I did want to say a couple of, actually the latter part of the year, I mentioned, a great researcher who I've had a decent amount of correspondence with, and was finding out some really awesome things related to Ed Wood, in addition to many, many other things. So he, and again, I don't want to get into any details, step on his research toes, but an actor who appeared in a number of a handful of movies that Ed wrote the screenplay for. He did some yeoman's research into him, and again, I won't get into the details, really found out things that are staggering to me in terms of detail, but it also alerted me to the fact, as we were back and forth talking about this, that the gentleman moved back home from Hollywood in his latter years, and back home happens to be about 15 minutes away from where I live here in northeastern Pennsylvania, in a very different kind of area he lived. I live in, a little town here on the river, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, but he lived out in kind of a very rural area, and in matter of fact, in his later years, worked as a real estate agent in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a little bit larger town. You may have even heard of Scranton, Pennsylvania, to the north. Right? I believe The Office, the sitcom The Office, is set in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Right? I used to work out of the office in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Now I work entirely remotely, owing to COVID. Owing to COVID, I also have only had to cut my hair, 3 times in the last 2 years. But it is a terrible thing, and I do want to actually acknowledge that as we go into 2022, worth acknowledging that, there's still going to be a lot of suffering out there, and there has been an enormous amount of suffering already. So I want to, extend my condolences to all of those who have been impacted in some way, shape, or form, had their health impacted or worse by COVID. We've all been impacted by it in significant ways, certainly. Won't get into a big rant on that and politicize the Ed Wood Summit podcast. But what I found out was this gentleman who moved back home, he actually lived in a couple of places right near where a friend of mine lives. So I was at this friend of mine's house, an apartment rather, a couple weeks ago. I stopped by and I picked him up to go have lunch. And we went to a place where I'm fully well suspect this gentleman who worked on a couple of Ed Wood movies ate all the time, probably in his latter years, and when he was a kid growing up in that general area. And he had a house, very rural area by a little lake, and we ended up driving by. My friend said, "Let's drive by my old house if you want to see it." And it was right down the road from where this gentleman actually lived. He didn't know him, though. But the cemetery where this gentleman's actually buried is right next to the apartment building where my friend lives. Literally right next to it. As soon as you drive out of the lengthy parking lot, the cemetery is right there. It was raining that day. That's Chanel again. I'm sorry, but I believe that somebody probably pulled in the driveway. That's what the bark indicates to me. And yes, there's the front door open, so I was right. So sorry for all the background noise, but hopefully she'll calm down here momentarily. Chanel, come on.
Are you talking to me?
So, yeah. So, I was gonna, maybe, stop by the gravesite and pay my condolences, but it was raining and cold, rainy day in mid-December, so I ultimately said, I'm gonna come back when the weather's a little bit nicer and take a nice little ride around this very nice rural area, but can't imagine anything more antithetical. You can't imagine living more antithetically to Hollywood than in a place like that. So he did ultimately live, a good quarter century or so or at least for a couple of decades in Hollywood, and made an enormous amount of films, as a matter of fact. But again, that's my friend's research that's rooted in, so I'm not going to name names on that one, but hopefully he'll write something about it, or will talk about it at some point in the relatively near future. But if at some point down the road, in the springtime perhaps, I'll head back on over to pay my respects at this gentleman's grave. So, was there something else? There was one other thing I wanted to mention, and now I can't remember. One of the folks who worked with Ed Wood actually smoked also when younger and has been encouraging me really, really strongly to quit smoking. So I might take a stab at him and smoking for way fucking too long. And might take a stab at it. It seems cheesy to do it as a sort of New Year's resolution, so I don't want to do that. How many times? I've probably done that. I think I've done that. Actually, I remember the first time I think I actually tried to quit smoking when I was in college. I thought, I don't want to really get hooked to this extent. I started smoking more heavily when I started smoking when I was in high school, but by the time I was in college, I started, smoking habitually. So one January, I said my resolution is going to be to quit smoking. And I remember making it for about 25 days into the month of January before one night I was out with a friend of mine, and on a whim, I'm like, I'm going to grab a quick pack. I've been good, right? I've been good. I'm going to get a pack of cigarettes. Sorry, I'm going to be right back in 1 second. I have to let Chanel in from outside. Come on. Chanel. Sorry, I kicked the laptop cord out, so. I do remember what the one last thing I wanted to talk about was. So on my birthday earlier this year in March, unbeknownst to me, I had taken the day off from work because it was my birthday, and I was laying in bed in the morning, and that was Elise who came home moments ago. She graduated from high school this year, so she just came home from work. And Jen, she, I call her the CFO, that's AKA Kitten. She's out with a friend of hers who's in town for the holidays, so they're out doing a little Christmas shopping for next year. Nowhere to lie, she already started buying Christmas presents for next year. There's a method to the madness, though, because you get things really cheaply in the immediate aftermath of Christmas, so you can really maximize your spending dollar and get way ahead of it. I wait until the last fucking minute. Everything I do in my life, it's just me. And it bewilders her to no end. She's like, I would be stressed all the time if I waited all the time to do things at the last minute, but I'm quite comfortable with that. I need the deadline. I need something to kind of kick me in the ass. So on my birthday, unbeknownst to me, they were going to they took off work and school, again unbeknownst to me, on a Monday, and were going to take me to Poughkeepsie for my birthday. We were going to, for obvious reasons, drive around Poughkeepsie and see some of the old Ed Wood haunts. Something I've been wanting to do for a while because I don't live far from there. It's just a couple hours drive, and I've been meaning to do this actually for years. On a couple of occasions had planned to do it, but loosely planned it, and it never ultimately came to fruition. So hopefully this coming year in 2022, that is absolutely something that I'm going to do. I want to actually do a little sort of guerrilla documentary, have them follow me around with their cell phone cameras and talk about things as I wander around Poughkeepsie. So perhaps we'll see that in 2022. But we didn't get there that day because when they woke up, I'm a late riser. When they woke up, our dog Lou, who was quite old at the time, already a couple years past life expectancy for his breed, he was still in pretty good shape. He was, he didn't seem like he was struggling at all. He had slowed down a little bit, perhaps, and everything seemed okay. But he was really, really sick that morning, and in the a week or two running up to that, he had started to throw his food up with some degree of frequency. So they thought we really need to take him to the vet. So when they came home a little bit later, they were crushed. They said, Lou's at the vet still, and he's very ill. The veterinarian, in matter of fact, said you should just put him down now. You can, treat him, and to a degree, he'll might have a little bit of time left, and so. Three of us discussed it a lot that evening, and we brought him home the next day, and we thought we're going to take care of him. Medicines, variety of different medications around the clock, and he did have some down days, but he also had a lot of really upbeat days as well. and ultimately we were really happy that he got to spend an additional 7 weeks with us, and it was a very profound experience for me. Uh, I'd never had a dog before. I grew up with cats my whole entire life, so he's the first dog that I ever had, and he was a great dog. He was really affectionate and funny. He had a funny sense of humor, but during his taking care of a sick animal, not dissimilar to taking care of a sick family member. It really it can be a profoundly. I found it to be a profoundly moving experience. Really, no different. I know people who perhaps don't have pets or have never connected with a pet that deeply are probably like, "You're crazy, Greg." But again, we felt good with the decision that he passed naturally and without um, any evident horrible suffering, and we were all present right when all three of us were present right when it happened. So again, that was a profound experience in 2021. But the other dog, obviously, you've heard here a couple of times over the course of the last hour or so. Again, I was expecting to just do a brief look forward and look back, but this ended up being a little bit more expansive than that. I appreciate you tuning in to the Edwood Summit podcast generally. If you read articles at Edwood Wednesdays, I appreciate that. I appreciate more than you know all of you gentlemen out there who I correspond with about Ed, and many of whom you know who you are. We've become friends over time, and so I appreciate our friendship in woodology as well as our genuine friendship, and I'm looking forward to having other additional guests, including many of the guests that we've had on in 2021. Hopefully they'll all be back, and additional folks will be on in 2022 as well. And who knows what other discoveries are out there. I didn't go into 2021 thinking that Saving Grace and the Frank Leahy Legend script were going to turn up, not whatsoever. So I don't know what's going to happen in 2022. There are still, of course, a lot of sort of holy grails out there, and I'm hopeful that some of those will start to turn up. I don't expect it personally. Yeah, I'm going to turn up a copy of Postmortem. Actually, Operation Red Light is one of my personal holy grails, and there was a day, this is a number of years ago, when I came home and I checked my email, and I got an email from Jack Descent, who was the co-producer of Operation Red Light and also the cinematographer, and he said, "I found it. We're gonna get it. The elements from Operation Red Light." And I'm like, "Holy shit!" Right? So it was a false lead, as it turned out. I think I still hold out hope that it does actually exist, and we'll see. For someone perhaps will turn that up in 2022. I'm sure there'll be other I've heard that there are a few other Ed Wood books in the works that might come out in 2022 by written by other folks. So hopefully it'll be a big year. All these years later, now we're going into the 44th year after the death of Ed Wood. 44 years later, and still these new discoveries are being made, and more clarity is being established around what he did do, works that should genuinely be attributed to him, as well as things that shouldn't be attributed to him, as well as rounding out his biography to a greater extent. So I guess that's a good place to wrap it. So I wish you all, a great holiday season if you celebrate the holidays, and I wish you and your families, obviously, health and safety in this crazy world. And join us if you find these podcasts fun or helpful, or even of some sort of benefit. Please join us right back here at the Edwood Summit podcast in 2022. Check us out, obviously, as well. I think of it as we, because on Edwood Wednesdays, that's Joe Blevins' his creation, so that's where the "we" comes from. But I should say I will certainly probably write, although Joe does do some pretty good copy editing on my articles often, and he certainly does a great job laying them out and provides a venue for them. So perhaps I'm not wrong to say we, but I will certainly be back here at the Edwood Summit podcast in the relatively near future, and sometimes others will be joining me. So join us back here if you're so inclined, and have yourselves a really wonderful start to your new year. See you next year. Bye.